Albert Pike was without question a deeply flawed figure. He was a Confederate general whose command collapsed in scandal, a lawyer who defended slavery and endorsed the expulsion of free black Arkansans, and a Mason who resisted racial equality within the craft. Yet he was also a polymath who mastered languages, reshaped the Scottish Rite, and left an indelible intellectual mark through morals and dogma. This study acknowledges both sides. It confronts his racism, nativism, and failed military career, while exposing how the Lucifer charge grew out of misquotation and outright hoax. The result is a portrait of a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his blind spots. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. Albert Pike remains one of the most consequential and most controversial figures in 19th century American Freemasonry. To evaluate Pike honestly requires recognition of both his genuine achievements and his serious failings. Early life and Arkansas career. Born in Boston in 1809, Pike demonstrated precocious learning, passing Harvard's entrance examinations, but unable to enroll for financial reasons. He migrated west in 1831, settling in Arkansas, where he taught school, wrote poetry, and in 1834 purchased the Arkansas Advocate newspaper. Admitted to the bar in 1836, he became a prominent lawyer, representing both private clients and native nations, Creek and Choctaw, in major claims against the federal government. He also compiled the first digest of Arkansas Supreme Court decisions. His personal life was marked by marriage to Mary Ann Hamilton, with whom he raised several children. Military service. Pike served as a captain in the Mexican-American War, where his published criticisms of his regiment's leadership led to a duel with future Governor John S. Roane. During the American Civil War, he was commissioned a Confederate brigadier general, charged with commanding native regiments in Indian Territory. His forces fought at the Battle of Pea Ridge in March 1862. Accusations of scalping and mutilation by some native allies created national scandal and caused a rift between Pike and Confederate High Command. He resigned his commission in July 1862. Post-war years. Following a period of exile in Canada, Pike was pardoned in 1865. He resumed law practice in Memphis and then in Washington, D.C. It was in these later decades that Pike made his greatest mark as a Mason, serving as Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, from 1859 until his death in 1891. He systematized rituals across the Rite's 29 higher degrees and, in 1871, published Morals and Dogma, a vast comparative study of religion, philosophy, and morality intended as a guide for initiates. Though often difficult reading, the book became a defining text for U.S. Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Intellectual contributions. Pike's intellectual range was remarkable. He mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, producing translations and studies of Vedic texts, and immersed himself in Kabbalistic, Hermetic, and Gnostic sources. In Masonic contexts, he sought to align the degrees of the Scottish Rite with what he believed to be universal truths found across ancient religions. His erudition and system building made him the single most influential figure in shaping the Scottish Rite in the United States. Negative aspects and controversies. Slavery and race. Pike lived and prospered in slaveholding Arkansas. While direct proof that he personally owned enslaved people is inconclusive, records indicate that his wife's family held slaves and that enslaved persons were used as collateral in a mortgage transaction. In 1858, Pike was a signatory of a Little Rock circular urging the expulsion of free black residents from Arkansas, leading to the state's infamous 1859 expulsion law. Within Masonry, Pike's racial views were exclusionary. In 1875, he wrote that he had taken his obligations to white men, not Negroes, though he acknowledged Prince Hall Masonry's original legitimacy. Nativism. Pike played a role in organizing the Know Nothing American Party in Arkansas in the 1850s, a movement explicitly anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. Civil War record. His Confederate service is associated with the Pea Ridge controversy. Though he denied direct responsibility for atrocities, his leadership was regarded as ineffective, and his resignation was not lamented in Richmond. Ku Klux Klan allegations. From the early 20th century, Pike has been linked by some writers with the original Ku Klux Klan, sometimes described as its chief judicial officer. These claims originate in later pro-Klan narratives, notably Walter L. Fleming's 1905 edition of Ku Klux Klan, its origin, growth, and disbandment, and remain unsubstantiated by contemporary records. Most modern historians classify the claim as unproven. Legacy. Albert Pike died in Washington, D.C. on the 2nd of April, 1891. His remains were later moved to the House of the Temple, headquarters of the Southern Jurisdiction Scottish Rite. His legacy remains contested. To admirers, he was the great systematizer of American Freemasonry, a polymath who sought to unite the wisdom of the ages. To critics, he was a Confederate general tainted by slavery and racism, a nativist politician, and an author whose abstruse prose invited dangerous misinterpretation. Both views contain truth. A full and fair study of Pike must acknowledge his profound contributions to Masonic philosophy, while recognizing the moral failings that mark his place in the broader history of 19th-century America. Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, 1871, contains only a handful of references to Lucifer, but these have been disproportionately cited in allegations of Pike's Luciferianism. It is crucial to examine the actual passages in full context and original wording to discern Pike's meaning. Notably, the term Lucifer, Latin for light-bearer, appears about 6 to 8 times in the book, concentrated in 2 sections: the lecture on the 3rd degree Master Mason and that on the 19th degree Grand Pontiff. In the 3rd degree Master Mason lecture, Pike uses Lucifer in a rhetorical and comparative sense. One occurrence is a critique of hypocrisy. Pike lists examples of moral hypocrisy and says to inculcate humility and in pride surpass Lucifer is to be like a whited sepulchre, outwardly pure but inwardly corrupt. Here, Lucifer clearly symbolizes pride, alluding to the proverbial pride of the fallen angel in Christian tradition. Pike is not praising Lucifer at all. Rather, he's admonishing those who outdo the devil in arrogance while feigning piety. Later in the 3rd degree lecture, Pike gives a more esoteric explanation drawn from occult and Kabbalistic sources. much of which he openly extracted or paraphrased from the 19th-century French occultist Eliphas Lévy. In this passage, Pike discusses the nature of Satan and evil in symbolic terms. The true name of Satan, the Kabbalists say, is that of Yahweh reversed. For Satan is not a black god, but the negation of God. For the initiates, this is not a person, but a force created for good, but which may serve for evil. They represent this force, under the mythologic and horned form of the god Pan. Thence came the he-goat of the Sabbat, brother of the ancient serpent, and the light-bearer, Phosphor, of which the poets have made the false Lucifer of the legend. Several important points emerge from this dense passage. Pike, following Lévy, distinguishes the mythic Lucifer of Christian legend, essentially a poetic personification of the force of evil, from its true nature. The term light-bearer or phosphor is used in an initiatic sense, an astral or life force that can be benevolent or maleficent. The false Lucifer is the vulgar legend of a personalized devil. In other words, Pike is arguing that the popular story of Lucifer as an evil fallen angel is a misinterpretation, false, of an impersonal force or principle which, in itself, was created for good, but can be turned to evil. Far from endorsing devil worship, Pike is demythologizing Lucifer. He regards the Lucifer of Christian legend as a distortion, the false Lucifer, of a deeper truth intelligible only to initiates. This heavily Gnostic and Hermetic interpretation portrays Satan, Lucifer, not as an independent evil god, but as the symbol of the negative or fallen aspect of the divine, essentially the absence or inversion of God, hence Yahweh reversed. The most famous and widely misquoted lines about Lucifer occur in the 19th degree lecture, Grand Pontiff. He writes, "The apocalypse is, to those who receive the 19th degree, the apotheosis of that sublime faith which aspires to God alone and despises all the pomps and works of Lucifer. Lucifer, the light-bearer. Strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light, and with its splendours intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not, for traditions are full of divine revelations and inspirations." In context, Pike is actually denouncing Lucifer's pomp and works. He expresses rhetorical astonishment that the spirit of darkness is called light-bearer, and pointedly asks, paraphrasing Isaiah 14 verse 12, whether Lucifer truly bears light that blinds the unworthy. Rather, Pike is suggesting that evil can appear as false brilliance. Lucifer's light is splendor that blinds the selfish and the vain. In other words, those of impure heart will be dazzled and misled by Lucifer's apparent light. Pike is here invoking the traditional metaphor of Lucifer as an angel of light who deceives, not endorsing Lucifer as a benevolent being. Indeed, he prefaces the exclamation by reaffirming that the initiatic faith despises all the pomps and works of Lucifer. Pike's tone is poetic and somewhat ironical. He highlights the paradox of calling a dark force light-bearer, only to stress that this false light serves to test or punish the unworthy. Immediately following those dramatic lines, Pike continues to say that traditions are full of divine revelations given in many ages and creeds, implying that truth and inspiration are not confined to one faith. He mentions that even pagan sages like Plato and Philo were inspired. This indicates that Pike's intent is to place the Christian story of the war in heaven, Lucifer's fall, into a broader, symbolic and inclusive context of divine truth in many traditions. In short, when read in full, Pike's Lucifer passages do not glorify Lucifer as a deity. Rather, they use Lucifer as a symbol, sometimes of pride and evil, to be scorned, and sometimes of the paradoxical nature of enlightenment, whereby true divine light can be perverted to blind the foolish. Pike's own summary elsewhere in Morals and Dogma underscores this. The conviction of all men that God is good led to a belief in a devil, the fallen Lucifer or light bearer, an attempt to explain the existence of evil. In other words, humanity imagined a fallen light bearer to account for evil in a world governed by a good God. To avoid doubt, we may catalogue the exact references to Lucifer in the standard edition of Morals and Dogma, 3rd degree, Master Mason, to inculcate humility and in pride surpass Lucifer, page 73. Context: condemning hypocritical pride by comparing it to Lucifer's fall, negative, pejorative usage. 3rd degree, Master Mason. The light bearer or phosphor, of which the poets have made the false Lucifer of the legend, page 102. Context: occult philosophical discussion, drawn from Levi, explaining that the false Lucifer of Christian legend is a misrepresentation of a force/principle, neutral usage in explanation, Lucifer as legend, not literal. 19th degree, Grand Pontiff. Aspires to God alone and despises all the pomps and works of Lucifer, page 321. Context: affirming that the Masonic faith rejects Lucifer's works, explicit rejection of Luciferian pomps. 19th degree, Grand Pontiff. Lucifer, the light bearer. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Doubt it not. Page 321. Context: rhetorical flourish, highlighting the paradox of the name Lucifer, and warning that Lucifer's light can blind the profane. Cautionary usage, often misquoted. 19th degree, Grand Pontiff. The fallen Lucifer, or light-bearer, Shaitan the adversary, Ahriman and Typhon. Piece 324. Context: explaining that cultures personified the principle of evil as figures like a fallen Lucifer. Neutral explanatory usage, equating Lucifer with similar mythic figures like Satan, Ahriman, etc. On the contrary, Pike either uses Lucifer as a negative exemplar, the proud spirit cast down, or as a misunderstood symbol for a natural force. The oft-quoted lines on page 321 in fact say the opposite of what anti-Masonic conspiracy theorists claim. Pike does not proclaim Lucifer is God, or encourage Lucifer-worship anywhere in Morals and Dogma. This reinforces that Pike offered these Lucifer references not as articles of faith, but as allegorical insights within a much broader comparative religious framework. Understanding Pike's use of Lucifer requires situating it in his broader esoteric worldview. Albert Pike was a polymath and mystic who drew on Gnostic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Christian sources in constructing his Masonic lectures. In Morals and Dogma, Pike references everything from Hebrew Kabbalah and Neoplatonism to Hindu scriptures, and Eliphas Levi, whose works on magic and symbolism deeply influenced Pike. Within this eclectic tapestry, figures like Lucifer appear not as literal biblical personages, but as symbols loaded with multiple layers of meaning. Two key motifs frame Pike's approach to Lucifer: the Latin meaning of the name and the Lucifer myth as allegory. Lucifer in Latin simply means light bringer, from lux light plus fera to bear. Early Christian Latin usage preserved this sense. Notably, Lucifer appears in the Vulgate Bible once, Isaiah 14 verse 12, as a translation of Helel ben Shachar, shining one, son of dawn, a taunt addressed to the king of Babylon who fell from his heights. Over centuries, Christian interpreters, and especially English literary tradition via Milton's Paradise Lost, repurposed Lucifer as a proper name for Satan before his fall. In his writings, he often plays on the irony that a word meaning light-bearer became associated with the Prince of Darkness. Pike's answer is rooted in Kabbalistic and Gnostic interpretations of evil. As seen in the third-degree lecture excerpt, Pike, via Levi, notes that Kabbalists viewed the devil not as an independent power, but as the inverse of God, the negation of God. The force personified as Satan, Lucifer is, in this view, originally good, part of God's creation, but becomes evil when isolated from the divine harmony. This aligns with certain Gnostic sects and occult philosophies, where the figure of Lucifer can be seen, controversially, as a misunderstood agent of enlightenment, or at least as a necessary foil in the cosmic order. For example, 19th-century esotericists sometimes recast Lucifer in almost Promethean terms, a bringer of light or knowledge against tyrannical authority. Pike himself stops short of any open praise of Lucifer, but he does engage with the idea that knowledge and divine light can be corrupted into prideful rebellion, hence Lucifer's fall. In Pike's words, "For the initiates, Satan, Lucifer, is not a person but a force, the instrument of liberty or free will." This remarkable statement reflects a Hermetic worldview. Lucifer represents the force of intellect and freedom, which can lead to enlightenment or to destruction depending on how it's used. In positive terms, that force is phosphoros, Greek for light-bringer, equivalent to Lucifer. In negative terms, it becomes the false Lucifer of legend that the poets turned into a demon. Pike thus implies that the wise understand Lucifer as a metaphor for the dual-edged nature of knowledge and free will, whereas the profane simply demonize it. In some Gnostic Christian texts, the figure bringing knowledge, for instance the serpent in Eden or Lucifer in later lore, is cast in a heroic or ambivalent light, seen as liberator of mankind from ignorance against a jealous demiurge. Pike was familiar with Gnostic ideas. He mentions early heresiarchs like Simon Magus and notes how they mistaken and personified the Logos or wisdom. However, Pike remained within a broadly theistic framework. He was not a dualist, positing two gods. He firmly states the ultimate unity and goodness of God. Thus, when Pike invokes Lucifer, he is as likely to quote Isaiah 14 chapter 12, "Lucifer, son of the morning, how art thou fallen?" as he is to draw on classical or occult references. For instance, in the third-degree lecture, he alludes to Pan and the goat of Mendes, imagery associated with pagan nature gods and later with the occult, Baphomet, as embodiments of the generative force that churches misconstrued as the devil. By linking Pan, the serpent, and phosphor, morning star, together, Pike echoes the Renaissance and Enlightenment era explorations of Hermetic symbolism, where the morning star could symbolize intellectual illumination as well as, paradoxically, the ego that defies God. Despite his occult interests, Pike repeatedly affirms core virtues of Christianity, truth, charity, hope, and often quotes the Bible and Christian fathers. In the very passage where he discusses Lucifer in the 19th degree lecture, his larger point is exalting a faith that aspires to God alone. The mention of Lucifer serves as a contrast to the true light of God. Pike's theology, if we may call it that, is dualist only in a metaphorical sense. Light versus darkness, knowledge versus ignorance, selfish pride versus divine truth. Lucifer falls on the negative side of that equation, the darkness masquerading as light. Pike warns that many feeble or selfish souls are blinded by that false light. So, while Pike ventures far beyond orthodox theology in his sources, the moral he draws is not far from Christian teaching. Pride and self-idolatry lead to spiritual blindness. In summary, Albert Pike's engagement with Lucifer is symbolic, philosophical, and steeped in esoteric syncretism. He draws on Hermetic Kabbalistic ideas to interpret Lucifer as a principle of light and liberty that, when perverted by ego, becomes a force of darkness. He engages Gnostic themes of hidden wisdom and false appearances, yet remains grounded in a fundamentally moralistic stance, good versus evil, with God as the ultimate good. Pike's Lucifer is part of a rich tapestry of symbolism. It is not the devil of simple church catechism, but neither is it an object of worship. Indeed, Pike famously wrote that Masonry uses false explanations to mislead the profane, to conceal the truth, which it calls light. In that vein, his references to Lucifer can themselves be seen as a test. Those with imperfect reason might take them at face value and accuse Masonry of Lucifer-worship, whereas the adepts perceive the deeper allegory of inner light versus outer darkness. Despite the nuanced and often critical role Lucifer plays in Pike's writings, by the late 19th century, a sensational narrative had arisen accusing Albert Pike and Freemasonry at large of literal Lucifer worship. This elaborate hoax, orchestrated by French provocateur Léo Taxil, real name Gabriel Hogan Pages, in the 1880s to 1890s, fabricated an entire Luciferian conspiracy within high-grade Freemasonry and falsely cast Pike as its ringleader. Léo Taxil had initially been an anti-clerical writer who ironically converted to Catholicism, only to then produce a series of fantastical anti-Masonic publications designed to titillate the Catholic audience. In 1886, Taxil began publishing exposés of Freemasonry, but it was in 1891, shortly after Pike's death in 1891, that he unveiled his grandest fraud, the tale of Palladian Freemasonry. According to Taxil, there existed a secret inner circle of Freemasonry called the Palladium, headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina, where Pike lived, dedicated to worshipping Lucifer and satanic rites. Taxil concocted a cast of characters, most famously a mystic woman named Diana Vaughan, who was purportedly a high priestess in this Luciferian order, but later repented and converted to Catholicism. Through books and articles, allegedly written by Diana Vaughan, but actually penned by Taxil, he spun out lurid stories of demons, devil worship, and instructions from Master Albert Pike. A key piece of fabricated evidence from the Taxil hoax was a set of paragraphs, now sometimes called Pike's Luciferian Encyclical. In 1894, the French anti-Masonic author Abbé Abel Clarin de la Rive published a book, La femme et l'enfant dans la franc-maçonnerie universelle, Woman and Child in Universal Freemasonry, in which he reproduced a purported letter from Albert Pike to high-ranking Freemasons. This letter, entirely spurious, is the source of the notorious quotation in which Pike is made to declare Lucifer as God. Reeves' book claims that on July 14, 1889, Pike, as Sovereign Pontiff of Universal Freemasonry, issued instructions to 23 Supreme Councils, including: "That which we must say to the crowd is, we worship a God, but it is the God that one adores without superstition. Yes, Lucifer is God, and unfortunately, Adonai is also God. The true and pure philosophical religion is the belief in Lucifer, the equal of Adonai. But Lucifer, God of light and God of good, is struggling for humanity against Adonai, the God of darkness and evil. This outrageous proclamation, placing Lucifer as a benevolent deity and demonizing the biblical God, Adonai, never appeared in any of Pike's writings. It is entirely a fabrication of the anti-Masonic fringe." As the Taxil Hoax Wiki summarizes, while Clarin de la Rive published this quotation, citing Diana Vaughan as the source, it does not appear in Taxil's writings proper, but was likely concocted as part of the Diana Vaughan narratives. The Catholic Church, which had long condemned Freemasonry, e.g. Pope Leo XIII's 1884 encyclical Humanum Genus, explicitly suggested Masons were in league with the kingdom of Satan, found vindication in Taxil's revelations. Anti-Masonic activists across Europe seized on the idea of Luciferian Freemasonry. Albert Pike, by virtue of his prominence and the convenient fact that he resided in Charleston, the supposed world capital of palladism, became the chief villain in this myth. Karl Hax, another pseudonym used to write Le Diable au XIXe siècle, the devil in the 19th century, churned out ever more salacious details, that the palladists conducted satanic masses, that Diana Vaughan conversed with demons. One demon, Taxil claimed, even played the piano in the shape of a crocodile, and that Pike's Freemasonry indulged in orgies with the devil. Taxil brazenly told the audience, with a mixture of pride and cynicism, that he created absurd lies, so grotesque he thought people would see the joke. But instead, the public made me the arch-liar of the period, gobbling up every word. Taxil's confession was printed in Le Frondeur newspaper and caused great embarrassment to the Catholic establishment that had endorsed his stories. Interestingly, even Abbé Clarin de la Rive, who had circulated the fake Pike letter, publicly recanted his belief in Diana Vaughan after Taxil's hoax was revealed. Even after Taxil's confession, the lurid idea of Freemasons secretly worshipping Lucifer proved too delectable for conspiracy theorists to let die. The forged Pike Luciferian doctrine quote was reprinted in later anti-Masonic and anti-occult works, often without mention of its true origin. Edith Starr Miller, Lady Queensborough, in her book Occult Theocracy, 1933, quoted the Pike "Lucifer is God" passage in full, as if genuine. In the mid-20th century and beyond, fundamentalist Christian anti-Masonic tracts, including Chick Publications comics and various evangelical books, have repeated the claim that Albert Pike taught that Lucifer was God of Freemasonry. It became a staple of the modern Masonic conspiracy genre. Brent Morris, a Masonic historian, aptly calls it "the lie that will not die," noting that no other falsehood has captured the imagination of anti-Masons quite like this Leo Taxil hoax. In 1896, before Taxil confessed, Arthur Edward Waite, a noted British mystic and scholar, had already smelled a rat and wrote Devil Worship in France, a scathing debunk of the Taxil/Vaughan claims. The Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon has an online bulletin expressly documenting Leo Taxil's confession and clarifying that all the Palladium/Lucifer stories were fraudulent. A 1913 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia, New Advent, entry on Taxil concedes he fabricated the Diana Vaughan memoirs and that his motive was to lampoon the Church's credulity. Thus, by the early 20th century, educated opinion had exposed the hoax, yet in the shadows the myth persisted, continuously republished by those with an anti-Masonic agenda. To summarize the historical trajectory, Albert Pike himself was never a Luciferian except in the minds of his detractors. The direct catalyst for the Luciferian slander was the Taxil hoax, which produced fake evidence of Lucifer-worshipping Freemasons and falsely attributed the most extreme statements to Pike. This was amplified by a climate of 19th-century anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, which often went hand in hand with anti-Semitic and anti-occult sentiments in Catholic and reactionary literature. Indeed, Taxil's fabrications played upon the age-old trope of secret societies as devilish anti-church cabals. After Taxil's exposure, the legend took on a life of its own in conspiracy literature throughout the 20th century, from Lady Queensborough's occult theocracy in 1933 to modern internet memes. It is telling that even today, one can find the fraudulent Pike quote circulating on social media as proof of Masonic Satanism, oblivious to the fact it was a Victorian-era practical joke that deceived many, then was admitted as false. It exploited the mysterious aura of Pike's morals and Dogma, a book little understood by the general public, by grafting onto it a sensational narrative entirely foreign to Pike's actual content. To anyone who reads Pike's real words, as we did in Section 1, the absurdity of the hoax is evident. Pike's Lucifer is a symbol of pride and false light to be shunned, not a god to be worshipped. Having examined Pike's actual words, his philosophical context, and the origins of the Lucifer-worship accusation, we can now render an informed judgment on the credibility of the Luciferian allegations. Quite simply, the claim that Albert Pike was a Luciferian, in the sense of a devil worshipper or promoter of Lucifer as a god, is unfounded and false. First, on a textual and doctrinal level, Pike's Morals and Dogma contains no endorsement of Lucifer as a deity. Nowhere does Pike encourage his readers to pray to or revere Lucifer. In fact, whenever Lucifer is mentioned, it is either as a pejorative example, the arrogant angel of pride, or as a metaphor for something else, the hidden truth that can be twisted, the false light. Pike's moral framework is about aspiring to God, the source of light, and shunning evil, darkness. He speaks often of God, using terms like the deity, the grand architect, etc., in reverential terms, and Lucifer figures in his work only as a symbol related to the problem of evil. If one were to accuse Pike of heresy, one might note his interest in non-Christian wisdom and perhaps an unorthodox interpretation of Satan's role, but that is very different from worshipping Satan. Pike explicitly states, for instance, that the evil force, which people personify as Satan, is a force created for good, but which may serve for evil. This is a nuanced, perhaps romantic-era view of the devil, seeing even Lucifer as part of God's plan, in a way, but it is not Luciferianism as a religion. Traditional Luciferianism, as understood in occult circles, is a system where Lucifer is venerable as a source of light, or even as a liberator. Pike does not advocate that. Second, historically reputable scholars and primary witnesses concur that Pike was not a Luciferian in the malicious sense. Frederick Gregorius concludes, "While Pike was not by any definition a Satanist or a Luciferian, the ambivalent description of Lucifer in Morals and Dogma has contributed to the image of him as the primary proponent of Luciferian Masonry. This neatly summarizes the situation. Pike's intent was not Luciferian, but the way he discussed Lucifer, in a learned, perhaps convoluted manner, unfortunately gave ammunition to those who would paint him as a Luciferian. In retrospect, Pike's tone was risky. Without clarification, lines like "Lucifer, doubt it not" can certainly be misconstrued. But to any fair-minded reader, Pike's denials of evil, he talks of despising Lucifer's pomps, negating Satan, etc., and his theistic affirmations make the accusation of worshipping Lucifer untenable. Third, the allegations rest almost entirely on hoaxes and hostile secondary sources, not on Pike's own actions or words. No historian today gives any credence to the idea of a Palladian rite led by Pike. Brent Morris have published detailed refutations, e.g. Morris's article Albert Pike's Luciferian Doctrine, The Lie That Will Not Die, which dissects the quote's provenance and urges readers to actually read Pike's text instead of believing unfounded claims. When we strip away the Taxil embellishments, there is zero evidence that Pike or any mainstream Masonic body ever proclaimed Lucifer is God. On the contrary, Pike's writings, private correspondences, and the policies of the Scottish Rite all point to conventional deism, theism, with a heavy dose of allegory and symbolism, yes, but not devil worship. The Scottish Rite's Supreme Council in Pike's time opened their meetings with prayer to God, Almighty Father of the universe, not to Lucifer. Pike himself, in his 1868 message to the Supreme Council, spoke of Masonry's core values as belief in God, love of neighbour, etc., with no hint of subversion. Fourth, one should consider Pike's character and life. Albert Pike was a lawyer, a poet, a Civil War Confederate general, and a devoted Mason. He spent decades of his life in an almost monk-like scholarly retreat, poring over ancient texts to draw moral lessons for the Masonic degrees. The Taxil hoax capitalized on the fact that Pike was distant and mysterious to most people, an elderly savant in Charleston, which made him an inviting target for myth-making. But primary accounts from those who knew Pike, fellow Masons, recall him as austere, brilliant, and perhaps a bit irascible, but certainly not a leader of a satanic cult. The complete implausibility of the grand Luciferian conspiracy, requiring, as Brent Morris wryly noted, that millions of Masons keep such a blasphemous secret without a peep of protest, also diminishes the credibility of the allegations. In fairness, what can we say about Pike's own view of Lucifer? At most, Pike could be described as having a philosophical Luciferianism in the literary sense, meaning he was intrigued by the figure of Lucifer as a metaphor, akin to how poets like Shelley or Byron saw the figure of the rebel angel. Pike's references show he understood the mythic and allegorical power of Lucifer as the fallen morning star, a figure representing knowledge, pride, and the fall. Pike might even agree with some Gnostics that the pursuit of knowledge, Lucifer's light, can appear heroic, but becomes evil when divorced from divine love. In one private lecture, unpublished in his lifetime, Pike muses that good and evil are coexistent, light and darkness, and that God's plan permits a Lucifer to test and challenge humanity, ultimately for good's ends. To conclude, the Luciferian claims against Albert Pike collapse under scrutiny. Pike's actual morals and dogma text, read as a whole, reveals a man who revered divine light, by whatever name, Holy Spirit, truth, wisdom, and abhorred what he saw as false lights of tyranny, bigotry, and self-worship, which he sometimes personified as Lucifer. The irony is rich. Pike's ambivalence about the Lucifer legend was meant to teach a moral lesson, yet that very ambivalence was twisted by others to defame him. Academically and objectively, we must affirm that Albert Pike was no Lucifer worshipper. In the final analysis, Pike's legacy should be judged on what he actually wrote and did. As researchers, we give Albert Pike the same fairness he extended to all faiths in morals and dogma. We separate the truths from the impostures. The truth is that Pike's Lucifer was a symbol of the dilemma of free will and knowledge. To label Pike a Luciferian is to fundamentally misunderstand or misrepresent both the man and his writings. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit fromthequarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.